Hey folks, welcome to the channel. We're on part 5 of our 7 Days of Pumpkinheads series, and we're going to do something a little bit interesting here in just a second. So first the title. Let's take a look at 7 Days of Pumpkinheads, part 5, Clowning Around with Hands and Claws. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Pumpkinhead towards the end of this piece. So there's a little bit of a sketch that goes in, and then we're going to jump into Procreate. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about hands, and maybe even a little bit more appropriately about anatomy of hands. So we're going to just rough this in really quick, jump over to Procreate, and pick it up from there. See you in just a second. Now that we're in Procreate here, let's just take a brief look at how the anatomy of the hand works. And I don't want to get into a lot of medical jargon or anything like that. That's not the purpose of this. I just want to kind of take a look at some basic shapes. So this won't take long. So don't worry about all the labeled parts here or anything. What I'd like to, again, just take a look at is our basic shapes. Starting with what I'll call the trunk of the hand. Take a look at this nice little pentagram shape that shows up here. We'll see it actually also here in the bone section as well. And this little pentagram shape is handy because it helps us start understanding the placement of fingers. Cartoon hands tend to have straight fingers very parallel to each other. And notice how this middle finger comes off the point of our little pentagram here, and the rest of the fingers kind of come off at an angle as well. And this is important because when we look at that bone structure that comes in a little bit later on, this is really what kind of sells the idea, is that these bones do extend down into the wrist, but they meet almost at a point down here. So again, straight parallel lines not really happening, and the same thing can also be said with how knuckles line up. So here would be our knuckles right here, our main bulbous knuckles rather, but notice how the rest of the joints of the fingers line up in kind of arcs to each other. Okay, just simple little stuff like this make all the difference in how you're drawing your hands. And that certainly applies to when we have the fingers extended like this, but it also applies to things like a fist. So, when we draw fists, we might be tempted to go something like this, where we just make nice parallel rectangles to represent the fingers and maybe like a little thumb that peeks out from the front here like this. But the reality is the fists, or at least the fingers of a fist, actually tend to angle in towards each other a little bit, okay? Knuckles will kind of come in like this, and then again our thumb will peek out in the front like that. So this idea that everything kind of angles in towards each other a little bit, I'm exaggerating it certainly here, but this is really the more naturalistic pose. These little basic things like this can help out with your hands quite a bit, and the rest of it is really just kind of practice till you build up the muscle memory and understand how that anatomy works in a way that's visually stimulating or visually pleasing to the eye. One of the other things that might be handy to point out here is this concept of how I construct fingers. When you're drawing cartoon hands, it's really easy to kind of draw them as kind of these, sausage shapes that kind of come out and, just are kind of mass, so to speak. But really, when we get into fingers themselves, it might be a little bit more helpful to kind of construct them almost as if each joint of the finger is its own three-dimensional kind of rectangular box, so to speak. Okay, and if we look at it like this, now, it's a little bit haphazard, but the reason I'm doing this is because I want to be aware of planes when I put in my shadows and my light a little bit later on. So this finger right here now has some different planes on it that I can put in shadow and sell this idea again that this has some sort of three-dimensional surface to it. Now, yes, fingers do curve a little bit more, right? So the idea here is that I would fade this shadow as I got towards this surface, assuming that the light is pointing right here. Now again, long diatribe here just to kind of explain what's going on in my head as I'm drawing out fingers. And I will get into this little concept a little bit more when we get back into the time lapse. So let's just kind of stop that right there, get back into the time lapse, we'll pick it up from there. Okay, so here we are back into the time lapse, and you can immediately see how I took some of those principles and applied it to the rough sketch of the hand that I'm laying out. That pentagram shape is very obvious in the palm, and as I'm laying in the fingers there, notice I'm focused on these rectangular box type shapes that I'm going to try to flesh out and make more like three-dimensional boxes a little bit later on. Thumbs always have like something of an unusual little hook to the end of the tip of the finger bone there, so I try to kind of emphasize that a little bit to really sell the idea it's the thumb. And then you notice on the surface of the back of the palm there, I've laid in a couple of those lines that point towards the center of where the wrist is to kind of show you where there's, I don't know what to call them, ligaments, I guess, that extend from the knuckle back into the wrist. They kind of show up based off of how this hand is very stretched out. I also wanted to make this hand, or maybe more specifically the fingers, look like they were very skinny and very bony. So these jutting out lines are going to be very important to making sure that idea comes across. The same thing can also be said about the ends of the knuckles of each of the joints. I'm really trying to emphasize the detail of these knobby bones that are kind of jutting out of the flesh at the end of each joint. So big rounded sections of line work there will kind of help sell this idea that these are not just rectangles, but actually bones with knobby ends on each end of the joint. If you remember from the title of the piece, we called this clowning around with hands and claws. So claws are definitely a part of this. This is Halloween. We're going to sell that scary element, certainly. So we're going to put some elongated fingernails here. And I started drawing fingernails on all my hands a little while ago because I started realizing that if I got the placement of the fingernail right, it, again, just did this idea of selling the illusion that this was a three-dimensional finger rather than some sort of a sausage tube that you'll see typical of cartoons. If the placement of the nail doesn't line up just right, it can look a little bit off. So it's important to be careful about it and spend some time on it. But if you do it and you do it right, it really kind of pulls off a really interesting illusion. And again, helps sell three-dimensionality on the page. I love trying to show as much depth as possible in my work. And these little tricks like this with shadows and with these like little pieces of perspective, maybe is the best way to put it, you can really kind of get that depth that you're looking for if that's what your goal is. So moving on to the second hand here, we're going to do a really extremely foreshortened forefinger there with the claw coming out. I'm not going to do all the fingers like this, but just one or two, again, just really kind of helps sell the illusion. Notice how the rest of the fingers are going in, not in a straight parallel lines to each other, but instead this curve that we saw when we drew the fist in our little Procreate adventure a little bit earlier. The claws are going to be drawn out as straight lines extending from the center of the fingers. That way I can kind of sketch in the rest of the shape a little bit later on. And again, notice if we just kind of think of it almost like it's at a tilt, we still get that pentagram shape in the palm. That point that lines up the middle finger is kind of more pointing towards camera, and the base of the pentagram is kind of fading in the background. And that's really kind of one of the things you have to start wrapping your head around, is how to take these basic shapes like that pentagram that we're using for the palm and view it in a three-dimensional plane where you can actually move one edge away from camera, one edge towards camera. If you can kind of do that in your head, then this is the way that you can kind of start picturing some composition, start laying out little things like this. Now again, this hand is following the same rules I followed with the first one. So in the fingers you can see that I'm just slowly taking these rectangular boxes and trying to evoke a shape of a finger out of them. I want to try to pay attention to knobby knuckles. I want to make sure that the fingernails line up in that claw fashion. And just because of the fact that I'm working with the underneath of a palm, I am going to try to sketch in some of those lines of where those little kind of lifelines and stuff on a palm would lie. Thing about this is that when we get into the coloring phase a little bit later on, a lot of this line work is going to be hidden by shadow. That palm that we're looking at right now is going to be mostly, very, very dark. So we don't need a ton of detail here, but I find that it's handy just to make sure that my anatomy is right before I go in and painting in a lot of blackout. One of the last things I decided on when I was putting this composition together is that if our clown here was going to have some sort of claws, they were going to have to poke out from the torn, ripped edges of the fingers of gloves. I wanted him wearing gloves like a clown would, and again, the claws just kind of tearing through the tips of the fingers of those gloves. So I kind of sketched in that little bit of detail the last second, and then moved into the anklet phase of the drawing, where I made sure to try to emphasize that a little bit and try to, try to get some reminders of where the shadows would lie if those little tears of fabric were really there. Again, a lot of this is going to be hidden by shadow, but I want to make sure that I understand where it is, so in case I want to highlight or emphasize little points of it when I go in and add in light source a little bit later on. Remember, the idea is that these were very kind of like thin, knobby, knuckled fingers, so a lot of line work is being put in there for the detail around the wrinkles of the knuckles. I don't know that we're necessarily going to call these old hands, but they're certainly supposed to be creepy and scary, so the detail line work really kind of helps sell that creep factor, so to speak. But again, the most part here, the anatomy is drawn in. And there are going to be a couple things here that I'm not 100% happy with. Like that left hand with that foreshortened forefinger looks a little bit off to me. But I know that the foreshortening is right. I know the angle is right. I know the perspective is right. It doesn't look very good right now. It looks a little bit flat. And the thing is just kind of understanding to accept that. Right now, in this initial phase where it's just kind of line work and very little shadow, it is going to look flat on page. And therefore, the forefinger there doesn't look like it's being drawn in perspective correctly. But once we are able to get in our coloring and our shadow and our light, especially with that shadow underneath the palm, it'll make the back portion of the hand seem to recede in the distance, and that foreshortened finger will make a little bit more sense to the eye once that trick is achieved. And that's really what it comes down to, is just kind of trusting that you'll know what it looks like when the final product is rendered. That's a tough thing sometimes. You have to really kind of trust in your own skills when it comes to that, and be accepting of the fact that not everything's going to look the way it looks in your head until the final product is there. And in the meantime, you're going to go through stages where it just doesn't look right. So again, at some point or another, you just kind of have to trust your method. Now, our ink work here on the hands is finishing up, so we're going to go ahead and bring our pumpkin head back in. And now that it's here, we can talk a little bit about what this composition is really all about. So this series of Pumpkinhead paintings is all really kind of based on a Jeopardy game that I put together with this pumpkin-headed character is something of the host of the game show. One last comment on this, if I can. First of all, again, this was a Jeopardy game that I built in PowerPoint. If you're interested in seeing the final product, let me know, and I'll try to make a special video about that. But in the meantime, I'm just going to kind of press forward and just mention that this character was used to introduce a category that was all about Hollywood special effects makeup. And so I wanted to put makeup on our pumpkin character to kind of represent the kind of teaser photo for this category of questions. So we got our pumpkin head in here, but the next thing I wanted to do is get that Pennywise from the movie It kind of clown makeup on the face of this pumpkin. I really wanted that white makeup to look like it was kind of slapped on haphazardly, so you could still see the edges of the orange pumpkin around the side of it. But the red makeup, the lipstick and the nose and everything like that, I wanted that to be pretty tight. So again, I wanted a lot of texture in the white portion of the makeup, just because I wanted it to look like it was painted on, like it was almost like a thick layer of base makeup. But I just wanted a little bit cleaner look with the red portions of it. So I've got my shadows started to paint in. I'm getting my lights painted in. So if you haven't been able to tell so far, I'm using basically warm light source, cool shadows. I usually work in opposites when it comes to that. I'm really trying to use my shadows to emphasize a couple major things. Number one, the striations or the bumps and the crevices of the pumpkin head itself, as well as the large shadow that the pumpkin would cast over the neck and the shoulders. That really helps the rest of that body, again, recede in the background and allows those hands come forward a little bit. The hands I kept on their own separate layers so I could put the shadow and light on those separately, because I wanted to be subtle about how I did it. Remember, I want the figure to kind of recede in the background, and I want the hands to come forward, but I know that the palms and the forearms are going to have some pretty heavy shadows themselves. Now, one of the tricks I kind of worked out with this one is I spent some time kind of figuring out where I wanted the shadows to be and where I wanted the light sources to be and how to balance all that out. But I still wasn't happy with how dark it was. Remember, this is supposed to be a creepy Halloween type painting. So eventually I took the layers that I put the shadows on for the hands and I just duplicated them. And it did seem at that point that it got a little bit too dark, so I took the second layer, the cloned layer if you will, and I just lowered the opacity on it until I kind of found that nice balance of shadow from dark to light that I was looking for. So you'll see the kind of shadow, or at least the darkness of the shadow, kind of pop in and out a little bit as we kind of go through this, but that's really all it was, is me just kind of taking a couple of copies of that shadow layer, getting it super dark, and then just kind of dialing it back a little bit until I was happy with the end result. Now, we're not quite there yet. I'm still kind of doing some of the painting on this and deciding the way that I wanted to place these shadows and ultimately the light source. One of the really cool things about this is I was able to bounce light off those long, kind of craggy nails. Again, really kind of sold this three-dimensional effect, and notice how it was kind of like an airbrush kind of blended effect. It's got fuzzy edges, so to speak. So here's where I'm darkening up the shadows a little bit. I'm kind of deciding how much I want to dial that in. And that's pretty much going to bring us to the end of this piece. Now, again, the idea here is to focus mostly on hands. So if you have any questions about the hands, or if you want a little bit more in-depth study on that, let me know in the comments section, and I will post another video about it. One more shameless plug here. If you haven't done so already, make sure you click that subscribe button, click the like button, and, of course, share, like. I've got more coming soon. Make sure you tune in. In the meantime, thanks for stopping by. Take care.